These are your fast facts on the book of Colossians. First, the Christ hymn is one of the key features of this book. The hymn in Colossians 1:15-20 is a significant mountaintop in this little letter. Like the poem in Philippians, some have suggested that Paul is drawing on a church tradition that predates the letter. But regardless of the origin, Paul is putting his stamp of approval on the significant statement it makes about Christ. The hymn itself is beautifully balanced. In verses 15 and 16, Paul emphasizes Christ's lordship over the old creation, all the things that exist inside and outside the world we live in. Then, in verse 17, he begins to make a transition. Starting in verse 18, all the way through verse 20, Paul emphasizes Christ's lordship over the new creation, the church, and the eventually reconciled cosmos. Second, no one really knows the false teaching that Paul confronts in chapter 2. One scholar has counted at least 44 theories that have been offered to explain the exact nature of the heresy that Paul addresses in chapter 2. Some have seen these individuals as Gnostics, members of a mystery cult, local syncretists, confused Jewish Christians, Essenes, or even vanilla brand Judaizers. In short, it's hard to put an exact name on the contours of the belief and practice that we see in chapter 2. Perhaps Doug Moo's 12-point summary is most helpful in providing some perspective on the beliefs of these individuals. 1, it was a hollow and deceptive philosophy, according to chapter 2, verse 8. 2, it was dependent on human tradition, according to verses 8 and 22 of chapter 2. 3, it was dependent on elemental spiritual forces of this world, in verse 8. 4, it was not dependent on Christ, verse 8. 5, it involved dietary restrictions, according to verse 16. 6, it involved the practice of certain Jewish holidays, according to verse 16. 7, it involves ascetic disciplines, according to verse 18 and 23. 8, it involved angelic beings, according to verse 18. 9, it involved visions, according to verse 18. 10, it resulted in pride, according to verse 18. 11, it results in losing connection with Christ, according to verse 19. And 12, it involves a number of rules as a means of spiritual growth, according to verses 20 to 23. Third, Colossae was a city on the brink of insignificance. The major Roman trade route had been rerouted to bypass the city of Colossae. As the new road was cut, commerce and jobs began to dwindle, and the future of the city was in decline. The once colossal city would be soon destroyed and rebuilt elsewhere, leading some scholars to refer to the city as the least important city to which Paul ever wrote an epistle. Fourth, Colossians is closely connected with Ephesians and Philemon, and less so with Philippians. Colossians contains a verbatim 2-verse parallel of Ephesians, indicating that they were likely written and carried by the same person around the same time. Many of the parallel features of these books are addressed in our video on Ephesians. Colossians shows a number of overlaps in the recipients and bearers of the letter to Philemon. It seems that Philemon was a member of the Colossian church, and Onesimus was returning back to his hometown, bearing both the Colossian epistle and the letter to his estranged master. Fifth, Colossians is probably the reason that Philemon is in the canon. Although those who doubt the authenticity of Colossians ground its acceptance into the canon on the basis of the author smuggling in references to the characters within the letter to Philemon, which is nearly universally understood to be genuine, the reality is that the highly personal letter to Philemon would be an odd addition to the canon were it not grounded in and connected to a canonical epistle that was more broadly for a church. Thus, placing ourselves in the first century context, we can more easily see how a Pauline Colossians assured the canonicity of a very Pauline Philemon, rather than a second century Colossians being dragged into the canon by a Pauline Philemon. Sixth, Colossians emphasizes a realized Christology and eschatology. Colossians certainly emphasizes the here and now realities of those who are in Christ. We have been raised with Christ, according to chapter 3, verse 1. And this resurrection isn't something that is simply far off. This kind of approach to Christ and to the end times has led some to doubt the authenticity of the book because they assume it's very un-Pauline to talk about the here and now in this sort of way. But not only does Paul use realized language elsewhere in his epistles, he also uses futurist language within mere verses of this key realized text in Colossians. If you look down in verse 4, Paul expresses that we will appear with him in glory, a future aspect. There is part of our salvation that is already realized, but there is still much that is not yet here. Seventh, Colossians explains how the New Testament epistles circulated. In chapter 4, verse 16, Paul instructs the Colossian believers about a letter to Laodicea. He commands them to exchange letters. The most likely means for facilitating this exchange was the handwritten copy of each original. Thus, we begin to see how the early letters of Paul made their way around the ancient world. Eighth, what does firstborn of all creation mean? Colossians 1:15 includes a statement that Jesus was the firstborn of all creation. The Jehovah's Witnesses take this to mean that Jesus was the first created thing. This is inaccurate on at least 3 counts. 1. Firstborn in the ancient world was primarily a figure of speech referring to one's status, not one's order of origination. Psalm 89:27 provides a hint in this direction. The firstborn is the one who gets the inheritance, according to Hebrews 1:2. 2. We must either read this as the firstborn who is part of all creation, by whom all things were created, or the firstborn who is over all creation, by whom all things were created. This first is logically contradictory. You cannot create yourself if you are part of creation. Creating yourself isn't an option. The second option makes the most obvious sense. For this reason, without any textual warrant, the Jehovah's Witnesses have inserted the word other into verse 16 so they can maintain the first option without any logical inconsistency, reading, the firstborn who is part of all creation, by whom all other things were created. Third, we must not forget the first part of verse 15. The image of the invisible God. An image is something that is made visible. Thus, Paul introduces the phrase about the firstborn by saying that Jesus is the invisible God made visible. It's hard to make a clearer statement about the deity of Christ, maybe with the exception of chapter 2, verse 9. So, however we understand the idea of firstborn, it cannot contradict with what is said in the very same verse. Ninth, what does it mean to fill up what is lacking in the afflictions of Christ? This statement in chapter 1, verse 24 is an odd one. It's been used to argue for the treasury of merits that the Roman Catholic Church would dispense to help certain souls avoid purgatory. In contrast, many reformers suggested that the phrase denoted the sufferings that Christ experiences as his church suffers, as when Christ said from heaven to Saul, 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 why do you persecute me, not my church? Over the centuries, this view fell into disfavor, and German scholarship introduced the idea of the messianic woes, an idea that came into full bloom among rabbinic teachers after the time of the New Testament, that a certain quota of martyrs must be met before the coming of the Messiah. In recent decades, the messianic woes view has struggled to demonstrate a helpful interpretation of this text, and others have turned to the context for an explanation rooted in Paul's mission. In the following verse, Paul explains that he is working to make the gospel fully known. It's no coincidence that the word fill up in verse 24 is related to the word fully known in verse 25. The way Paul is filling up the sufferings of Christ is by taking the gospel, along with his own measure of pain and suffering, to the Gentiles and establishing a beachhead for the gospel in the very heart of the Roman Empire. And those are your fast facts on the book of Colossians.